Hello, everyone. This is Volts for April 16th, 2025. What in Tarnation is going on in Texas? I'm your host, David Roberts. Texas is an endlessly fascinating energy transition story. Years ago, its conservative legislators put in place the closest thing to a free market in electricity in the U.S., which they have proudly shielded from federal interference. And it has worked to keep prices low and production booming. Lately, what that market is producing is gigawatts and gigawatts of clean energy. Together, wind, solar, and batteries constitute about 90% of the new electricity capacity installed in Texas over the last several years. Without any particular intention to do so, it has become America's renewable energy pacesetter. But Texas's conservative legislators, having created this miraculous market, are now souring on its results. For ideological reasons, they remain committed to fossil fuels, more so, it seems, than to the free markets they used to talk so much about. As we speak, they are debating several bills that would intervene in the market and have the effect of sharply curtailing clean energy development. Is Texas going to embrace its electrified future or cling to the fuels of the past and let all that economic growth go elsewhere? To discuss that, I am joined by Doug Lewin, widely known in the clean energy world as Texas Doug. He's been closely tracking energy trends in Texas for decades, including some work in the legislature and with several private companies. He is now a consultant and runs the excellent Texas Energy and Power newsletter and the Energy Capital podcast, to which I have become an enthusiastic subscriber. Can't wait to talk to him. All right then, with no further ado, Doug Lewin, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
David, thanks so much for having me.
This is overdue. Doug, we've let Texas news build up.
There's a lot of Texas news.
And now we've got a giant reservoir of Texas news to get through. I thought a good place to start for people who have not been, call it the last 5 years, post-2020, there's just been a lot of stuff happening in Texas, in the Texas energy sector. And, I'm not sure everybody's paying close attention or tracking it. So maybe I thought we could just start with some scene setting. Just sort of tell us the story of the last 5 years. What's been happening on the Texas grid in the last 5 years?
I mean, first of all, Dave, I'm exhausted. There's been a lot over the last 5 years, too much. And again, thanks so much for having me. I am a big fan of Volts and a subscriber there and really appreciate your work. I've learned so much from listening to the podcast, listening to you on Grist, et cetera. Look, 5 years, the last 5 years, it's an interesting time period to pick. Like most of us sort of work on Texas, things mark time by Winter Storm Uri, which was just about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago. That happened within that 5-year period you picked, and that really has changed quite a bit in what's happened here. But I think, and we could talk about Winter Storm Uri, I think we probably should at some point. But over the last 5 years, we have gone from effectively having no battery energy storage on the grid to having over 10,000, actually today, right at about 11,000 megawatts of storage. At the time of Winter Storm Uri, we were at 200. 4 years later at 11,000 megawatts. Solar at the time of Winter Storm Uri, you're, again, 5 years, you're talking right at, give or take, I'm doing this from memory, but 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts. We're now up to 30,000, so a 10x increase in solar in the last 5 years. Wind has grown, but not nearly at that kind of a rate. By 5 years ago, we were already at somewhere around 30,000 megawatts.
Yeah, wind's been pretty healthy in Texas for a while, right?
Yeah. Big growth in the mid-2010s, even early 2010s. But in the 2020s, much less growth of wind. So basically where we are right now is an easy way to think about it. While it lasts, it'll be different in a few months. But right now it's about 40, 30, 10. 40 gigawatts of wind, 30 gigawatts of solar, 10 gigawatts of storage, a little bit more. So 80 or so combined, which is, if you had said to me, Dave, 5 years ago, hey, in 2025, you're going to be at 80 gigawatts of combined renewables and storage, I would have said, I love your optimism, but I think you're a little crazy. But here we are.
I mean, I guess what people would want to know, though, is like, did they do that on purpose?
No. I don't think so. Well, let me be clear. Actually, I think what was done on purpose is, 25 years ago, and I think it's important to give credit where credit is due here. The legislature at the time, 1999, and Senate Bill 7, that opened the system to competition. Right. Some will say deregulation, but there's actually quite a bit of regulation on the system, and we should talk about.
I prefer restructuring. I feel like that.
Restructure. That's exactly where I was going to go. It's exactly right. There was a decision made that the lowest cost resources in Texas would win, and that we would pay only for resources that actually generate. We weren't going to have a capacity market where we'd pay for a bunch of plants to sit around idle. So that was a policy choice. And I don't think the only policy choice for renewables were made in 1999 in that restructuring bill when a very modest renewable portfolio standard was established. I believe the original number was 2,000 megawatts.
Wasn't that under Governor Bush, as I recall?
It sure was.
Crazy.
Yep. It absolutely was. And Governor Bush was a supporter of that at the time. Texas at that time was still a mixed government. There was a Democratic Speaker of the House, Pete Laney.
Wild.
And a Republican lieutenant governor. At that time, it was Rick Perry, who then ascended to the governorship when Bush was elected president. And so that's when that bill passed in 1999. And really, it was partly because there was a Democratic House, and they really wanted to build as wide a coalition as possible for Senate Bill 7. So there was not only a renewable portfolio standard, but there were some really important consumer protections. There was an energy efficiency resource standard, which was one of the very first in the country. And so that was a policy choice, but Texas far exceeded that goal. In 2005, they increased the renewable portfolio standard up to about 5,000 megawatts, again, with like a 10-year, just like with 1999, it was like a 10-year period to achieve it. And then we raced past that as well.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, looking back, that it was the market structure that encourages the low-cost power rather than the RPS that did most of the work here, right? You think that's fair?
I think that is fair. I think the RPS was kind of a first mover.
Yeah. Right.
But once that first movement happened, then yes, market dynamics and what is called in ERCOT economic dispatch, right? There's no preference like in some states, right? You have like environmental dispatch, you give a preference to a lower emitting source. We do not have that in Texas. It is only the lowest cost that is dispatched first. And that, as renewables, over those that you asked about 5 years ago, what's changed in the last 5 years? The lines kind of cross, right? Where renewables, particularly solar and storage, became cheaper and they've really started to win out.
That explains, I think, the shift from building out a ton of gas to building out a ton of renewables. But what explains just the speed, the quantity? You've written that Texas has added over 44,000 megawatts of power in the last few years, which is like a 35% increase over its base. It's adding a gigawatt a month to the grid. What explains that speed? Is that just the market too? Is that just market dynamics too?
I think it's market dynamics coupled with the fact that it is Texas and load growth here. The load growth story is everywhere, right? And
we're going to get to that.
We're going to get to that. But like, again, you asked about the last 5 years. Even before you get to data centers and what is AI going to do to the grid, Texas has seen an increase in electricity relative to the United States, something like 15 to 20% more energy growth here than in the rest. In other words, if you take both of them at like 5 years ago, Texas is like 15, 20% more electricity used now. The rest of the country is basically flat over the last 5 years with some small amount of growth.
What on earth? What explains that?
Well, I would explain it a couple ways. Number one, and I think this is really the place to start, is industrial load growth. Much of it from electrification of industry.
Interesting.
So, as a matter of fact, the first podcast episode I did of the Energy Capital podcast was with former Commissioner Will McAdams. He was a PUC commissioner, the first appointee by Governor Abbott after Winter Storm Uri. The other three commissioners had all resigned. He was the first one appointed. And I asked him on that first episode, what was something that was surprising to you coming out of Winter Storm Uri? And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, you can go back and hear his exact words, but basically something like, we were surprised by the amount of industrial electrification that had already happened. So you're already starting to see industries that are looking at the grid and going, man, there's a lot of hours out of the year where prices are like $0 or $10 a megawatt, right? Like basically a penny a kilowatt hour. Why do we want to keep burning gas on site if we could connect to the grid?
Let me highlight this a little bit. Those industrials are directly comparing gas and electricity. On-site combustion of gas versus grid electricity. And electricity is winning on price, purely on price.
Well, and I think what happens for a lot of these folks, it's kind of like, you remember like the early days of when Walmart started talking about sustainability.
Oh, yes.
It's like, at first it was kind of greenwashing, and then they get into it and they're like,
wait a minute.
Oh my goodness, like there's a lot of benefits to the bottom line here. This is incredible. And I think that's a lot of what happened with industry. So we now have a steel mill in Texas that's grid connected. We have, Dave, an LNG export plant that is entirely powered off of the grid. It is a 700 megawatt load. It is roughly the load of Waco or Lubbock, mid-sized cities in Texas. So yeah, I would say that is one of the major ones. And as a matter of fact, the utilities, a lot of people will say here, well, there's so many people moving to the state, our population is growing. And that is true. We get about 1,000 people a day, roughly net in migration over the last couple of years. But, what we have seen in the data, and the utilities do publish this data annually, what we're seeing is that the residential numbers, as far as power demand, are not actually going up that much. And I attribute a lot of that to like federal standards, right? It's really hard to buy an incandescent light bulb anymore. HVACs are to 14.5 SEER or whatever the exact number is, right? So I think even though there's more people moving here, residential load is basically flat, but industrial load, of all that load growth I was talking about a little while ago, something like 80 to 90% of it is large commercial and industrial loads.
Interesting. So really, this is like meat and potatoes economic development stuff. So briefly, we've got a lot of bills to discuss, but briefly I want to discuss Uri. These freezes are not unknown in Texas, but they're, I guess, getting relatively more likely. And as listeners probably vaguely remember, there was this winter storm Uri, caused a bunch of brownouts, blackouts in Texas. As I recall, the Texas grid was quite close to completely shutting down, which would have required like black start type stuff, which would have been like an exponentially larger economic blow, et cetera. So maybe just tell us, because if you listen to your sort of off-the-shelf Republican Texas legislator, he'll say, look, we're building out all these renewables, and then the next thing you know, we're having a crisis. Voila, what we need is more gas. I think that's what they're trying to do. So what is the real story there? What is the right lesson from Uri? And, hasn't there even been like a subsequent cold snap since then? Or am I making that up?
Let's start with what happened during Winter Storm Uri and why did the lights go out? Every generating resource, except for solar, interestingly, was below its targeted output level in extreme weather conditions. And gas and coal were actually the worst performers at like 50% of where they thought they were going to be. Gas plants had several problems. One was they were freezing. A lot of them were offline for freezing. Yeah. But many of them that didn't freeze and were able to operate could not get fuel.
The coal piles were freezing, as I understand it, right?
And coal piles as well. Yeah. Coal's performance was also very problematic. And of course, there were problems with wind turbines. And while solar exceeded where they thought it was going to be, they thought it was going to be quite low. So it cleared a very low bar. Right. And the state has 4 nuclear units. One of those went down as well. So you lost 25% of your nuclear output. So literally
Was that from freezing?
It was from freezing.
And the turbines, just out of curiosity here, turbines going down in extreme cold, is that them freezing up, or is that something, there's just not a lot of wind when it's that cold? What went wrong with wind?
Yeah, I mean, ice is the big problem there.
Ice, right.
Yeah, icing is really, and they can do some de-icing, and there's all sorts of things that can be done to wind turbines for that. Like if you're in North Dakota, you're going to do, I mean, this is part of the problem, right? Is this is, again, not just about wind, not just about any generating resource. The same with gas. Like if you're in a northern climate, you're generally going to have structures around a lot of the infrastructure. But in Texas, we don't, because if you put structures around it, then you got to cool it when it's 105 degrees outside. So they leave it to the open air, and that, of course, causes problems in the winter. So it's a system that was built for summer, right? I mean, it's always been a summer peaking system. That is now kind of in doubt, right, as to whether or not we're an actual summer peaking system or winter peaking system. So this is the other key thing during Winter Storm Uri that's not talked about enough. Gas supply freezing was a major problem, and that problem really hasn't been fixed, and we can talk more about that if you want. And then you have power plant freezing. There have been major improvements made there because ERCOT now inspects every single power plant in the state every 3 years. And we have seen in subsequent winter storms, none of which have been as powerful as Winter Storm Uri, average, like, the worst ones were around like 13 to 15 degrees average statewide low temperature. Uri was 6. The average statewide low was 6. And then the third main thing that caused Uri was excessively high demand caused by inefficient heat in poorly insulated homes. So it's a problem in Texas, but it's a problem throughout the South, is that you have resistance heat. It's basically a toaster oven or hairdryer technology sized to heat the entire home or apartment. This is really a problem in apartments where generally apartment developers will just, as a standard practice to this day, Dave, like even in 2025, we're still building apartments with resistance heat, which means that every little apartment, 600, 800 square feet, is a 5 kilowatt load. That means they're basically the same as a 3,000 square foot home up in the suburbs of Dallas on a 100-degree day, that they're using the same amount of power on a winter day. So demand was another really, really big problem with Winter Storm Uri. And that has also not been addressed.
What did they, just really briefly, what did they do? What came out of it? Tangibly, what changed?
2 major things I'd say. There's certainly more. Well, let's say 3. 1, the power plant winterization I was just talking about.
Yeah.
I think that is extremely significant. They did do this thing where they did this whole power supply chain mapping exercise, because part of what happened was, so first the gas fields freeze. This started happening on February 9th, 10th, 11th, like 3, 4, 5 days before the power went out. Steady increase in gas going offline, or I should say decrease in gas production and output. And then once the power started to go out, then you started to have gas infrastructure like compressors and things like that. They started getting cut off when the power was cut off. So we ended up in a downward spiral. Now, a lot of the oil and gas folks said that there was no gas problem until the power went out. That is empirically false. And that's in the NERC and FERC report, in the UT Energy Institute report. They show there were 40% reductions in gas output before the power went out. Then once the power went out, we got down to where at the depth of the problem around February 16th, at the worst moment, we were down 85% of the gas output out of the Permian was reduced. So yeah, I mean, just like really, really extreme. And then I would say the other big thing that came out of there was the legislature decided in their infinite wisdom that they would subsidize heavily new natural gas plants.
And this is that fund that we're going to get back to later.
Exactly. So that's a pretty big change. And I will say there was one really good thing in the Texas Energy Fund, and it was a constitutional amendment. I did not vote for it. I voted against it, but like 65% of Texans voted for it. I actually had to think about it for a minute because there was $1.8 billion in there for microgrids, or what they call the Texas backup power packages at critical facilities. Yeah, it's $1.8 billion, not a small amount of money for hospitals, water treatment facilities, nursing homes, police stations. And unfortunately, 2 years later, that still has not been implemented.
But why did you vote against it?
What I voted against was, it was a $10 billion fund. $7.2 billion was for gas plants.
Oh, right.
And I actually think we're going to build gas plants in the state. And if they're peaker plants, the emissions aren't that huge a deal. I'm not generally for building new gas infrastructure, but I think with this load growth story, we're going to get some, whether we like it or not. The bigger issue is just, should the state act as a bank? What happens to the energy only market if now you have the state subsidizing gas to this degree? And if you're a gas plant developer, are you ever going to build in Texas unless the legislature gives you more money? Like, probably not, right? So I just thought it was too distortive. Yeah. But that $1.8 billion in there was really attractive, and I almost voted for it.
Interesting. So, okay, one more piece of scene setting, which we've segued into quite well here, which is demand projections. Yeah. They're crazy everywhere.
Yes.
Particularly crazy in Texas.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what they expect, and is it mostly data centers?
So the answer to the last question there is yes, mostly data centers, but there's quite a lot of other loads in Texas that are looking to connect to the grid, including, by the way, oil and gas loads, because the oil and gas drillers want to connect to the grid for the same reason we were talking about industrial electrification, right? Just think of it as another industrial source. And right now, if you're out in the Permian putting a rig, and drilling, you're going to be using generally diesel generation. One of the most expensive ways to produce power. Yeah. So there's a real push to build transmission in Texas. And that push is mostly coming from the oil and gas industry.
Electrify oil and gas. That's my new
electrify fracking operations. Yeah. And look what's happening right now, right? Where we're recording obviously on April 7th. So when this comes out in a week, this should generally be the same, but things change so fast. I just like to say that because I don't want to look totally stupid when it comes out. But this week, we're seeing projections of oil for 2026 in the $60 range. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas does this survey of oil and gas drillers, and the break-even point in the Permian is right around $63-$64 for a new rig. So if the price of oil globally goes down to 60, people in Texas are going to be hurting. Local government, state government, that is a big part of the economy. And if you can actually connect your oil and gas drilling to the grid, that lowers your cost. That might get you below that break-even. So this is really I think, Dave, the main story about Texas right now is that the reality of renewables are starting slowly to catch up to the business class, the political class, right? People are starting to get their heads around oh, maybe this isn't a cage match of oil and gas versus renewables. Maybe renewables actually are super important for economic growth. Like you said earlier, we've added 44 gigawatts over the last 4 years, and 90% of that is from renewables. Where would our economy be if we didn't have solar storage? Where would we have been last summer, 2024, which was the sixth hottest summer in Texas history? Where would we have been 2023 in the second hottest summer in Texas history without all that solar and storage on the grid?
Some people are making this leap. Some people, the business community, let's say, we'll discuss whether that revelation has reached the legislature yet.
Yeah, I think it's reached a lot of legislators. There are some that are laggards and are not quite there yet. But let's come back to the load growth question, because I think it's really fascinating what's happening right now. So in April of last year, ERCOT, in a sort of it's super watched by stakeholders, but not by the popular press or the general public. It's a group called the RPG, Regional Planning Group, and they put together these transmission plans. And I got texts from a few different people that day of hey, are you watching this? So I tuned in, and ERCOT is projecting there April last year, so just about a year ago, that load in 2030 will reach 152 gigawatts. Now, our peak at that point was and it still is right at about 85 gigawatts. So going to 152 in 5 years, at that point in 6 years, just extraordinary.
Yeah, almost doubling.
Yeah, almost a doubling. Now, they have just almost literally today, the end of last week, and there's an ERCOT board meeting going on later today, and they've started to revise those, and now they're saying something like 137 by 2029. But here's the key to this, though, and how to put all these numbers in some context. There's some history and context behind these numbers. During the 2023 legislative session, the oil and gas industry pushed for a bill that was House Bill 5066. And this was the bill that started the planning around those transmission lines going out to the Permian Basin, which the commission is actively considering right now and may and hopefully will result in the first 765 kilovolt transmission lines ever built in the state of Texas. That decision is coming, but not here yet. And again, the oil and gas industry kind of wanted that. So they put into law some requirements for ERCOT to start really considering new loads. And this included this process they call officer letters. So if you're considering connecting to a utilities infrastructure, then you would tell the utility that, and then the utility, through an officer letter, an officer of that utility would sign something to ERCOT saying, we're getting this much load considered. Well, what they didn't know in the 2023 session was that this whole data center boom was about to happen, or maybe not the boom, but the speculative boom, whether it happens or not, we don't know yet. I think for the record, it probably will. So then you get to the point where these officer letters are just pouring in. And ERCOT is taking all of those and counting them in that number for 150. So what they put out today is if 50% of those officer letters come true, we would be somewhere around 121 gigawatts at the end of the decade. If 25% of them come true, we'd be at 113. So I think 113 to 121 is probably where we're going to be in 5 years.
Which is still crazy pants.
It would put us in the range of the kinds of growth we haven't seen in the state since the 1960s when air conditioners were finally hitting the grid.
And the hyperscalers, are they particularly attracted to Texas for the market, the climate,
Yes.
the energy mix? Why do they love Texas so much?
All of the above, right? I think first and foremost, well, let's say 1A, 1B. I mean, availability of renewables is a huge draw to a lot of these folks, right? I mean, it's cheap power. Now, does that mean they're going to be 100% wind and solar? Of course not. They're going to have batteries. They'll probably have some gas. We've already seen, Project Stargate, right? Which President Trump talked about in his very first day in office. Like, what did he spend his first full day in office doing? Talking about Stargate, which is this, OpenAI and Oracle SoftBank thing. And where's the first site? Abilene, Texas. Right now, they're probably going to have some gas there. They're also going to have a lot of renewables because, and this is again where a
lot of them have like promises and pledges and whatnot, like your Google and your Microsoft and your Amazon. Who knows how firm those commitments will be when it comes to it, but at least they say they're trying to do this with all renewables.
Yeah, and if you're going to do it anywhere, like you're going to do it in Texas, all renewables is going to be very tough for these kinds of projects. I think there will be some gas integrated there, and I think particularly if you're doing it in areas where otherwise that gas probably would have been flared or vented. Like Caruso is one of the projects, one of the companies that is involved with that Stargate project, and that's one of the things they've been working on originally for Bitcoin. That now they're primarily working on data centers. And so, yeah, I think the ability to procure cheap power, and that also means renewable power, right? Because like gas, you don't know, like what's the fuel cost going to be next month, next year, or 5 years from now? You don't know. You know what the fuel cost is going to be for solar and wind, right? You know exactly what it's going to be, right? So that's number one. But I would say like 1B, like right there along with it is the market structure. Because if you're trying to go to Georgia or North Carolina, for instance, like you've got to cut a deal with Southern or Duke. You've got to deal with the regulators and a special tariff.
And the interconnection queues are slower, much slower.
Much slower, exactly. So I think the market structure, the like speed to market, the ability to sign a bilateral deal without having to go through all the mother may I's associated with most of the other states. And look, the ability to build here, right? And that's a lot of what is at stake in this legislative session, right? A lot of legislators want to take that away. But assuming that's not taken away, which is a big assumption, the ability to actually build quickly in Texas is pretty much unparalleled anywhere else in the U.S.
Okay, so this is more scene setting than I intended, but it's good. So Texas is in the midst of a renewables building boom, unprecedented, also on the verge of unprecedented load growth, also struggling with its gas system, even as wind and solar and batteries race ahead. So this is the situation today. Into this situation comes the Texas legislature, the least hardworking legislature in, in the country. What do they meet is it every 2 years?
They're also the least paid, in fairness. So yes, they get paid $600 a month. That's what legislators get paid.
And they meet every 2 years for like 3 months?
It's a biennial legislature, right? The Constitution goes back to 1876 at the end of Reconstruction. So extremely, people that were very suspicious of government and put a very weak governor into the Constitution and a legislature that could only meet every 2 years.
And now it's like one of the top 10 economies of the world.
8th.
Let's discuss a few of these bills that are going on. I swear to God, Doug, I've been reading your newsletter, which, by the way, is just like excellent. Really reminds me of the old blog days, just like the joy of like, here's a dude who's obsessed with a thing and is going to explain it to you. I love that model. So let's discuss some of these bills. I was reading about them in your work and all the stuff you sent, and I swear at several points I thought I had my head around it, and then like some part of my brain is like, no, that can't be it. That can't be right. Like I just kept reading over and over again, but apparently it's all as crazy as it looks. So let's talk about some of the bills. So first, let's talk about some bills where like they're just clearly taking a shot at renewables. So there's this Senate Bill 819. Which basically, would impose these regulations on the siting of renewable energy that are, I think it's fair to say, exponentially tighter, more restrictive than anything that's ever been put on oil and gas in the state. So tell us about 819. What does it do? And is there even on paper a coherent rationale for this? Or is it just friggin' hippie energy? We hate it. Let's try to get it.
Yeah, I think mostly it's some landowners, very, very wealthy landowners that really don't like looking at wind turbines and have just kind of gone on this crusade against renewables. A lot of times this is framed as oil and gas industry against renewables. You have not seen the oil and gas industry come out for those kinds of bills. Again, they want the low power from renewables, right. So it's hard for me to give the rationale for it. I don't understand it. I work very hard to understand different points of view and to understand what people that think very different. I've done podcasts on this of like, I interviewed former Governor Perry for my podcast. I've interviewed people I interviewed Congressman Kazar. I talked to people all over the political spectrum. I try to understand people's views that are very different from my own. And I can't get my head around this. It is a major infringement on private property rights. Texas has held private property rights sacred for as long as it's a state. And before that, when it was its own country for 10 years, that impulse runs very, very deep. It would absolutely hurt rural counties.
Say what it would do first.
Yeah, okay. So it would put into place a requirement that there be permitting for renewables. So the PUC could approve or deny any solar or wind project. It has setbacks that would be bigger than just about any other state. I think and I know in the original bill it was 3,000 feet for wind. As like more than half a mile. The author of the bill, in discussing her own bill, asked by another member of the committee, she said, "It seems strident to me."
Which in her head she's like, wait, which lobbyist put that in? How did that
I guess I can't understand the thought process here.
And just to notice, like, you can build a fracking field like right next to a church or a playground or whatever, but a wind turbine, you got to be half a mile away.
So famously, Texas in 2015, there was a community, Denton. It's University of North Texas is up there. It's just north of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but a little bit north of that. Denton County's north of Tarrant County, which is where Fort Worth is. Pretty large county now, but it was kind of like just really in its high growth phase at that time. And a lot of folks in that community through the city council had passed an ordinance of like, hey, we'd like some setbacks on oil and gas drilling. So I said the Barnett Shales, you still had a lot of drilling up there and like right next to nursing homes and daycare centers and schools. And they passed an ordinance with some setbacks, and the legislature said, you can't do that. House Bill 40 in 2015 passed overwhelmingly with strong bipartisan support and said, no, you cannot do that. They took away the ability of local governments.
Can't do that to oil and gas.
Correct. And now, and frankly, you can't do it to renewables right now, but that's what she wants to put in place, Senator Kolkhorst, only for renewables.
Hilarious.
The bill does not address anything like a petrochemical facility, an oil and gas drilling rig, anything like that. The wind setbacks would be far more, I think like 15 times what any setback is for oil and gas drilling, right? As if wind was more dangerous to somebody than oil and gas drilling. It's
I know.
absurd.
We should just like maybe make a note here that like fracking fields and petrochemical facilities actually do produce pollution.
Yeah.
And wind turbines actually don't.
Yeah. And so here's the other thing I want to say about this, Dave, that I think is super, super important. And I will have out in my podcast feed, and we'll put it on YouTube as well. I think it's almost done. I've got this little like compilation of clips from the hearing. I have never seen an energy hearing like this. I've been watching the legislature on energy for more than 20 years. I've never seen a bill with even close to half as many people testify against a bill. 50 people testified in person against this bill.
Interesting.
100 registered for it, including folks you wouldn't necessarily suspect, Texas Association of Business, Association of Electric Companies, et cetera, like just a wide variety of different folks opposed to the bill. But what really struck me were three particular witnesses, one from Armstrong County, population like 2,000 or 3,000. And the gentleman from there said, look, we don't have oil and gas. This is a place that's just southeast of Amarillo, way up in the panhandle. He's like, we don't have oil and gas up here. We do have wind and sun. And he didn't testify to this, but you can look up the numbers on txrenewables.net. You can go county by county and see how many tax payments and payments to landowners were made. There are $50 million in payments to landowners and local governments from the wind farms they have there now over the life of the project. And they're planning to build another one up there that would add another $60 million. To a county of 2,000 or 3,000 people, that is like the lifeblood of that community. Why would a Republican legislator want to hurt rural Texas? And so that was Armstrong. You had a guy from Schleicher County near San Angelo in West Texas, a guy from Nacogdoches County in East Texas who said he had solar on his land and now he's able to pay for his kids' college. And he's like, I don't want people in Austin telling me I can't build solar on my land. They went ahead and passed it out of committee 7-3 on a party line vote anyway.
So, right. Well, so this brings me to my question, Doug, which is like, here's a bill with no rationale that you can even retrofit from the bill. The bill's own sponsor doesn't seem totally clued into what it does or why. Everyone seems to hate it. It's got this enormous public opposition. It's economically utterly daft. It's, just like, so surely it won't pass, right?
It may. We don't know, obviously. I'm certainly hopeful it won't pass. A very similar bill, it was called Senate Bill 624 in 2023, passed the Senate and did not pass the House. And like we were talking about earlier, I think there is a growing awareness, even among some of these people that are voting for it in the Senate, particularly those that sat there and listened to testimony from people in their district. I mean, the senator who represents that man from Nacogdoches, Senator Nichols, was sitting there during the hearing, listening to him, and I presumably voted for it anyway. I think he must have, because I think it's 7-4 Republican to Democrat, so he must have voted for it. But I think there's a growing awareness that renewables are really important for economic development in rural areas. Had testimony from the San Angelo Chamber of Commerce out in West Texas saying, we need this for our business development. I think there's an increased awareness, particularly with solar and storage, that we absolutely have to have it for the summertime. The ERCOT CEO, the chairman of the PUC have been saying publicly for quite a while now that we almost certainly would have had energy emergencies last summer without solar and storage. It's good for grid reliability. We also know that renewables have lowered costs for consumers by $20 billion over the last decade. There was a study out of the University of Texas done by Josh Rhodes that shows that there's over 20 billion of savings so far from renewables. So, what would happen to consumers without them?
Sure.
I am certainly hopeful that cooler heads will prevail, but you never know. Legislative sessions are crazy things and anything can happen.
Well, let's throw another one in there while we're talking about it. Senate Bill 715 made me laugh. It would require individual wind and solar resources to, as far as I can tell, firm, quote unquote firm, i.e. buy some natural gas, and not only each individual project has to do this, but it's retroactive. So all the existing wind and solar projects have to go buy some natural gas. Am I misreading that? Anybody who understands grids, I hope, understands that firming is a grid-wide, it's the level of the grid where you get firmness or lack of firmness. The idea that an individual solar field needs to firm itself is very peculiar. So
yeah,
am I missing something, or is that what it looks like? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. The idea that an individual solar field needs to firm itself is very peculiar. So
yeah,
am I missing something, or is that what it looks like?
No, that is what it looks like. And I mean, this bill has been pushed by the Texas Public Policy Foundation for a long time. They pushed a version of it in the last session as well. And yes, even the organization for the thermal generators called Powering Texas, they testified against the bill. The bill actually would require firming of all resources. I mean, the cost of a bill like that, Dave, would be astronomical, because as one witness at the hearing put it, you're basically creating 1,000 little mini ERCOTs. Every power plant has to be its own little grid.
Right.
You get no economy of scale. It's insane. It's not the way it's supposed to work.
The whole point of a grid, literally the point of a grid is to share. That it's literally why we build grids.
Yeah, they didn't say it this time, but testifying on a very similar bill 2 years ago, ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas literally said this would represent a tax on consumers, which is exactly correct, and a massive one at that. So again, hopefully cooler heads will prevail. I can't imagine, look, everybody just kind of knows in Texas, the Senate is just going to pass really, really bad bills. And it's unfortunate.
So the House is where you go for sanity.
Look, the Senate is where the idea for that microgrid, for critical facilities came out of last time, 2 years ago. I want to give credit where credit's due. It's like most things in life, right? It's nuanced, it's complicated. They passed a really good energy efficiency bill out of the Senate last session. The House didn't pass. So I think for the Senate, the main thing is, I hope they get to a point where they recognize that punching down at renewables, this is the article I wrote called a time for choosing, which is which way do you want to go? Do you want to try to destroy and push down and suppress? Or do you want to build up? Do you want to spend your time figuring out how to build a nuclear industry in Texas, how to build a geothermal industry, how to get high voltage transmission, how to reduce energy waste?
There's a lot to do, and every one of these wastes time that you could, especially when you only have a few months every 2 years.
Exactly.
Time is at a premium. So either one of those bills we just mentioned, if they passed as written, would just be devastating to the renewables industry in
That's correct.
Texas, and yet neither is the craziest bill on offer here. Now we're coming to the main course of crazy, which again, I had to read like 10 times because I literally didn't believe it. So Senate Bill 388 mandates that new additions to the Texas grid have to be at least 50% dispatchable, which basically means gas, because they wrote batteries out of it, which I'd like to return to, which basically means gas, meaning that for every megawatt of wind or solar or batteries that you install, you have to, by law, also install a megawatt of gas. It has to be 50-50. Is that as crazy as it sounds?
Yeah, it's every bit as crazy as it sounds. So, I mean, how you can define the word dispatchable to not include batteries is beyond
Can
me.
you explain that? What on earth batteries are like? The quintessential,
Yeah. I can explain it by somebody thinks, the author of the bill, Senator Phil King, thinks that gas is needed on the grid. And so he's defined dispatchable to exclude battery storage because the point of his bill is to try to get gas. The problem, of course, with this is, and hopefully the House will realize this, is that you can't actually get gas fast enough to meet, we were talking about load growth earlier in that 113 to 121, which is like the lower end of the range. You are not building 40 gigawatts of gas in the next 5 years. That is an impossibility. GE Vernova is only producing 20 gigawatts of gas turbines globally annually, right? So this is an impossibility. So what you were doing if you pass Senate Bill 388 or frankly 819 or 715 is you were imposing a cap on the Texas economy. You are saying this is the limit of growth. I mean, it basically turns the Texas legislature into degrowthers, right? Which is wild, right?
Kind of a trend in MAGA world, honestly, as we're seeing.
I guess they could reduce emissions that way by killing the Texas economy.
They're going to be secret climate heroes,
right? Seems like a wild way to go about doing it to me.
You said this, but we should emphasize it's not that you can't build enough gas plants that fast because you don't have enough money or political will. There just isn't the supply chain for it. Physically, Correct. You can't do it, no matter how much will you have.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And they did. So now it's every megawatt of solar or wind must have a megawatt of thermal, gas, coal, nuclear.
How would you even enforce that? Who is the enforcement mechanism here? Who does this apply to? If I'm a solar developer, do I literally have to also be a natural gas developer? How is this supposed to work?
Yeah, I mean, that is a weedier problem with the grid. There's just the basic, this is impossible, which is the main problem with the bill. But when you get down into the weeds of the bill, the mechanism of it, there was a proposal years ago, right after you'd have something called dispatchable energy credits, which of course was conceptualized to include batteries because they're very, very dispatchable. And what you would do for a credit program like that, it would work like renewable energy credits, and you would put the requirement on load-serving entities, right? Retail electric providers, munis, co-ops, things like that. It appears from the bill that the credit's supposed to be placed on generators. So you would have generators paying other generators, which is, again, part of the reason why no generators really like it, because they're all we don't really want to pay each other. We compete against each other. It's just a bizarre. And as far as I could tell, the bill didn't really have an alternative compliance payment. What if credits aren't available? Could you pay into a fund so you could still develop? That the bill was kind of silent. What's happening in the Senate, unfortunately, is they just aren't taking the time to really work with people that disagree with them and actually try to come up with, because if you want to get more dispatchable power on the grid, you can do that. There are mechanisms to make it work.
Well, batteries are flooding onto the grid at historic rates. Hallelujah, it's happening. What's the problem?
We added 5 gigawatts of battery storage in 2024. We will probably add more than that in 2025. And they are having a fantastic impact on the grid. They are helping grid reliability.
Precisely because they are dispatchable, precisely
Correct.
because they...
Let me just say this. In the summer of 2023, and it was hotter in 2023 than 2024, but 2024, again, was the 6th hottest summer we'd ever had. So it wasn't like it was a mild summer. We had 11 conservation alerts in the summer of 2023 and 1 energy emergency where frequency dropped to 59.77. We bypassed EEA1, went straight to energy emergency alert level 2, which is very, very rare. I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it might be. It's at least very, very rare. 2024, again, 6th hottest summer. Not only we not have an energy emergency, no conservation alerts all summer long.
Amazing.
Right? Solar and storage are so well suited to Texas summers.
This is happening in California too. I feel like I should probably do a pod just on this. I feel like it's an undertold story. Like batteries are coming and they are doing what people promised they would do faster and better and bigger than even anticipated. Like they're helping grids on a mass scale today.
And this, by the way, is really where Texas, I think, really needs some focus. We've made some strides, but we've started to lag. That progress has slowed down. Is on the demand side, on the distributed side.
Well, you're segueing, Doug. It's like you're setting me up here. You're tossing me lobs.
Brilliant.
So I wanted to, as the next topic. So just to wrap up, 388, it would require 50% dispatchable. It's crazy. And as you say, like the take-home message here is, if it were passed, it would effectively cap the growth of the Texas economy at the level of gas growth, which is very slow right now. So it would really be like shooting one of the most vibrant economies in the country in the leg for zero reason, for absolutely no reason. Okay, so done with that. So let's turn to, like, if I have massive load growth coming and I know it, and gas is slow, very slow to come online, and like even at historic pace of building wind and solar, there's almost no prospect that you could keep up with that ludicrous level of load growth. So all of that points to demand side. If we can't keep up on the supply side, let's turn to the demand side. That's energy efficiency and demand response. So I think Texas is sort of legendarily not very good on energy efficiency. Is that also true on demand response? Is there anything happening on the demand side in the legislature?
Well, not necessarily there's a little bit in the legislature. This week, there'll be some hearings on an energy efficiency council and some moves to rein in resistance heat. Some really good bills being heard this week, and maybe something will pass. But there are some good things in Texas happening, Dave. So like number one, Texas established the Aggregated Distributed Energy Resource Task Force and a pilot associated with that a couple of years ago. That pilot moved at very, very rapid speed to the point where now you actually can sell battery storage, or even where they're getting to the point where even other aggregated distributed resources can sell into the grid and actually earn ancillary service revenues.
Yeah, I had Base Power on the pod.
Yes.
People may recall, they're basically just like giving batteries away to residential customers in exchange for the ability to aggregate those batteries and sell the capacity.
And that's also, by the way, another advantage of having a competitive market, right? Is they're set up as a retail electric provider, low barrier to entry to become a retail electric provider. You really don't have to ask for permission. If you've got capital and a business plan and motivation, like you can get into the market and start signing up customers, which I think is a huge attribute for Texas. So this is really where I think things need to go, is we need to get those retail electric providers working to, with policymakers in the state, PUC, ERCOT, the legislature, to create some kind of a vision for the demand side that really takes into account all of the different things that are there. Because for the wintertime, you really got to go after resistance heat. That is probably adding, where there are two different studies now, American Council for Energy Efficient Economy and Texas A&M University, the second of which was a study commissioned by ERCOT. Both of those found that there are 12 to 23 gigawatts of economic reductions available from just replacing resistance heat with heat pumps.
You know, it's interesting. In most places where they're talking about electrifying heat, the danger is that you're creating a giant winter peak, right? Because mostly in most places, when you're moving to heat pumps, you're moving from natural gas to heat pumps.
Or fuel oil.
Or fuel oil to heat pumps. But here, if you're moving from resistance heating to heat pumps, you're actually going to have the effect of lowering the winter peak. So like, that's not something that heat pumps usually do.
No, but we are already a pretty electrified state. It's 61% of homes in Texas are electric. Only, about 35, 36% are gas. So really focusing on that electric to electric, making it more efficient is really where it's at. And then when you do that, you're getting in heat pumps that are usually have inverter compressors and can receive a signal. So now you've enabled more demand response, right? Mm-hmm. So demand response is particularly great for the summer. And this is a conversation I've tried to have with ERCOT and anybody who will listen, frankly, of just like residential demand response, because ERCOT is proposing at the board meeting happening today, they're proposing a new residential demand response program. And that's great. We should have more residential demand response.
But does this mean, just let me pause you, is this the style of demand response that they're talking about that they have today? Is that where they sort of like send a note to a bunch of ratepayers and say, hey, can you turn off your stuff at X hour? Like, is this all like voluntary? It's not automated, in other words.
There are no details associated with what ERCOT has proposed yet. They've only said they want to do something on residential demand response, but haven't said what yet. And I think that in the mind of ERCOT, though, it's not a conservation alert. They want to get away from conservation alerts. I think they want to be able to press a button and reduce demand. But my point is, if you look at Winter Storm Uri, the hour that the power first went out, the hour when the first rolling outages were ordered by ERCOT to the distribution utilities, it was 1:20 in the morning. What residential demand response are you going to use when it is -2 in Dallas, Fort Worth, and it's 1:20 in the morning? What load are you going to move? Right? You have to have energy efficiency, right? You've got to reduce the energy waste that is causing you the biggest problem, and that's inefficient heat. Now, that having been said, residential demand response is fantastic. And most of the problems on the grid aren't Winter Storm Uri, right? Most of the problems on the grid are 1 or 2 hours. Batteries help a lot. Residential demand response can help a lot. And then you get into, again, the batteries not just on the grid, but the batteries in people's garages. The batteries that I think, pretty sure it was your podcast where you had the guys who were doing the batteries with the electric cooktops. I think it was you, right?
Yeah. I had Copper on a long time ago. There's also Impulse is also doing that.
The price of batteries is getting so low right now that you could have a battery associated with your refrigerator or your electric cooktop, right? And they may not be huge, big batteries, but even a small amount times by millions of homes can make a huge difference on the grid. The problem with this right now in Texas, Dave, is that there is no vision for this. So NERC, in its December 2024 report, their long-term system assessment, they forecast that ERCOT will go from 3 or 4 gigawatts of distributed solar today to 22 to 24 gigawatts of solar by 2034. They didn't have a number in there for storage, but the way, I did a podcast, you did too, with Mary Powell of Sunrun, like we're starting to see more and more storage associated with solar. And we have sort of 2 routes here, chaos or integration, right? Is everybody going to do their own thing and it's just kind of everybody on their own? Or are we going to integrate all of these small resources for the good of the system, for the good of all the consumers in the state, for the good of grid reliability? Right now, I would argue we're more on the path of chaos because the utilities are trying to slow it down. They don't want to make it easy for people to connect DERs to the grid.
Well, this is aggregation. This is VPPs you need, right? Are they talking about VPPs?
They are talking about VPPs, and there is a pilot that is over at ERCOT right now that is signed up. I think we're in the range of, this is what you were talking about with base power. There's like 30 to 40 megawatts in there right now, and that could grow. There's a cap on there, I think, of 160 megawatts. But we really should see this at gigawatt scale. And as a matter of fact, NRG, the very big gentailer in the state, they own generation and retail, signed a deal with Renew Home, which used to be Google Nest, right, and Home Connect, to do a gigawatt of VPPs in Texas.
Yeah, so I had Renew Home on the pod too.
There you go. And so like, I think that these kinds of things are going to grow. I just think they will grow not only less rapidly, but also in a way that is less beneficial for grid reliability and resilience, unless there's some kind of vision around this. And then, we were talking about the backup power package earlier. There's all these different things happening on the distribution grid, and there's a lot of even policy initiatives. There just isn't anything that's kind of bringing all that together and creating some kind of a market mechanism. I really think that's what's missing, right? Is like, how do you define the energy attributes of whether it's energy efficiency or demand response, what hour was it delivered, where was it delivered, so that we can actually put a value on it? That is hard to do. If any place can do it, I think it's ERCOT in Texas.
Right. And, you've made the point many times, many people have made the point that just there's demand response and all this sort of fancy automated stuff and VPPs, but then there's also just old school energy efficiency, better insulation, it's all the old block and tackle stuff, which has the effect of lowering the difficulty level of everything else, right? Exactly. Just makes everything else easier. And on VPPs, I sort of wonder how the conversation is going, because the way I look at it is like, there's these hyperscalers showing up. They got a lot of money. They're really forcing the issue. They cannot be ignored. You need lots of power really quickly. Coal's uneconomic. Gas, the supply chain is tied up. As you say, it's like literally difficult to get gas. Renewables are fast, but the fastest way to get new power is just to exploit existing distributed capacity of residences and stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's just to exploit VPPs. You cannot get power faster than that. That is literally the fastest way you can get new capacity on the grid, is just gather up into your hands existing residences and coordinate them. I just feel like that logic is impeccable and inexorable. And in some sense, like, they're all going to end up there eventually. There's just no physical way around it. If you want lots of power fast, that's the big pool of fast power that you have available. That's it. Like, you can't get around it. So, like, how far away are they from this sort of like inevitable conclusion?
I mean, the other beautiful thing it does, I don't know how far away they are. I think we're still, unfortunately, kind of far. I think people are getting there. ERCOT saying, hey, we want to do more residential demand response is a recognition of exactly what you just said. I think they intellectually and theoretically understand that.
Right.
What is the mechanism to bring it about? And in fairness to them, that is difficult, right? Because you are, measuring megawatts, right? You're trying to measure something that is reduced, but it can be done, right? I mean, like, we have great software. We have ubiquitous smart meters. We know how much energy is used. We have baselines for a decade or more.
And there are other states. There are other states doing it better. Like, there are better examples out there if you want to go figure out.
And one more thing on this. I think that, because you talk about the data centers and the money they're bringing, it is very important to remember, and this probably isn't lost on any of your listeners, but I think I want to say it anyway because it's so important. And this is especially true in Texas. If you look at those load duration curves, 95% of the hours of the year, we have so much capacity, right? We have so much extra capacity. There's, on a tough year, a couple of 100 hours a year. On most years, less than 100 hours a year. And so if you can really look at what are those hours, when are they occurring, right? And usually it's like winter mornings. Now it's summer evenings. It used to be summer. 5 years ago, let's go back to where we started. You asked about 5 years ago. 5 years ago, in the summer of 2019, in August of 2019, anybody watching the grid, and there weren't that many people watching because Winter Storm Uri hadn't happened yet, but I was, there were energy emergencies in August of 2019 at 4 p.m. Mm-hmm. We no longer have energy emergencies at 4 p.m., right? If they're going to happen, they're going to happen at 6 or 7, right? And then you have springtime, which is often sort of looked past, but you have an aging gas generation fleet. A lot of the plants are very, very old. Even the quote unquote newer ones are 20, 25 years old. Think of the uptake you got to do to a 20, 25-year-old car, right? So they have to come offline for a month or two at a time. So we see these moments in the spring and the fall where, with a lot of thermal outages, if you get a day with lower wind, like, you can start to, and higher demand, right? Climate change is happening, and you might in April, like in March, we had a day in Austin in early March, it was 94 degrees, right? So those kinds of things start to happen more and more, and you can have a few hours in the spring. So now you look at, okay, what do those points have in common? it's almost always extreme temperature. Let's look at HVAC. Let's look at insulation. Let's look at thermostats. Let's do the things that have the biggest impact on the times that are tightest on the grid. And that then enables more economic growth. That allows space for these industrial loads of whatever kind, right, to come onto the grid.
Well, can we talk about Senate Bill 6 real quick? Because it's related to this data center question. So as I understand it, Senate Bill 6 sort of started good and promising and has lost a lot of the features that made it good and promising. But maybe just tell us what Senate Bill 6 is, what it was intended to do and its current state.
Basically, Senate Bill 6 was laid out as a bill to deal with these large loads coming to Texas. So again, like April, ERCOT makes the presentation. June, there's a hearing in Senate Business and Commerce. Senate Business and Commerce is the relevant committee that oversees ERCOT and PUC. They kind of freak out. Okay, all this coming. They start working towards some kind of a large load bill. There's a couple of different things in there that I still think are okay. One of which is in Texas, one of the forms of demand response, it's one of sort of the crudest forms, but it's still valuable, is what's called emergency response service. We have a 10-minute and a 30-minute. Things are going really bad. There's a signal sent, and it's half of it is demand, like load reducing, and half of it is sort of emergency generation spun up. Now they're looking to create a 24-hour product because especially in the wintertime, these winter storms don't just catch you by surprise. You can see them coming a week away, right? And certainly 3 to 4 days ahead, you know, like, okay, this one's going to be really bad. So this would create a program where industrials, because basically what happens whenever it gets cold is, you know, there's calls made and people call each other, ERCOT, PUC, various policymakers call around. Could you turn off? This would kind of organize that. That's a good thing.
It's incredibly analog.
It's incredibly analog, but like at least this would put some order to it and create some kind of a market around it. What I was more hopeful that the bill would do was actually start to create some incentives like a speed to interconnect, because that is the incentive that they want the most. Like there's bills floating out there right now that give tax breaks to data centers. These folks don't need tax breaks. They've got money falling out of their pockets. I know
this is not like sports stadiums. You don't need to seduce them. They're desperate.
Exactly. And so like I think it makes sense to give them a speed to interconnect if they, you know, sign a PPA for incremental new megawatts, bring new megawatts to the grid, have backup power on site. And what's the duration of that backup power? Like you get, if you put a 1 hour battery, that's worth some amount of credit. If you put a 4 hour battery or 8 hour battery or 12 hour battery, that's worth more, right?
And Doug, let me tell you the cool new acronym for this. Bring your own new clean energy.
It's named after a Texan.
Beyonce.
Yeah, she's from Houston, baby. Yeah.
Yeah, I got that from the Vote Solar people. I can't claim.
I heard that acronym for the first time last week, and I was on a Zoom call, and I literally came off mute and stopped the Zoom call, and I was like, how have I never heard this acronym before? That is amazing.
This is something everybody's struggling with these data centers, right? Are they obliged to put power equal to their demand on the grid when they come on?
Well, and in line with the Texas way, like I think the way to do this is not to oblige them, but to say, hey, if you want to interconnect, we'll interconnect you faster. It's a yes if, right? It's not you're required, right. But you know, if we are going to recognize that some of now you have to be careful there because you also have these more like this is the other thing I think is eventually going to happen. This may take years and years, but I think eventually we're going to have different rate classes for these different large load customers because I think that there definitely is something to that speed to interconnect for data centers. And then you have to think a little bit differently about, say, like we're getting big investments from Samsung for chip manufacturing, right? I don't think you want to set them up against a data center, for who's going to get interconnected first. Right. That wouldn't be fair because their energy cost, it's a huge portion and they're so sensitive to hundreds of a penny a kilowatt hour.
I mean, right? data centers are unique, I think, is like the bottom line here. They're not like other loads. They're very different than anything that has shown up on the grid in the past.
And Dave, let me throw out just one more thing about this Beyonce and speed to interconnect. Another possibility for the speed to interconnect would be for these data centers to create a fund to pay for reductions on the residential side, right? Because one of the things we're worried about are equity impacts. Like residential rates have gone up 20% in Texas in the last 3 years.
Right. And there's some talk among Texas legislators about we should stop this. We should, you know what I mean? Closing the door to new data centers precisely. Why should we be immiserating our everyday ratepayers for these giant corporates, which is not a crazy thing to think.
There's a lot of discussion around that. And again, I think that comes out of a place of fear where people are like, well, wait a minute, our grid is already struggling. Now we're going to add all these big loads. Your grid is struggling only a few hours out of the year. If these loads pay into a fund to reduce scarcity during those hours, to reduce the risk of grid outages, then that is a good thing for the grid. You could actually, by taking data centers, make the grid stronger, less fragile, more reliable, more resilient, if they're bringing their own power, putting backup power on site, helping reduce residential demand. All of this is possible.
Yes, and just a nod to Tyler Norris here and his team, which did this paper recently, which I probably should do a whole pod on, but basically if demand centers, the headline is always that demand center demand is inflexible. They need constant high supply. But if they can be flexible, just 3 to 5%, you know what I mean, of the year,
less,
you open up enormous new capacity. So that's another thing. If you want to connect to our grid, A, pay into this fund, B, pledge some degree of flexibility, and C, bring your own power, right? To me, that's the perfect data center bill.
Yeah, and help the residential customers in the area that you're moving into. I think that's the right formula. And I actually just interviewed Tyler last week. We haven't posted this pod yet, but in ERCOT, the number was 0.5%.
I was doing it from memory, smaller than I remembered.
Yes, that would free up 10 gigawatts.
Wild.
In ERCOT. 0.5% from the data center. So small amounts of hours yield huge benefits on the power grid. So, I really do think, and demand response really is a valuable resource, and ERCOT and the PUC and the legislature, they should all go after it. It needs to be coupled with energy efficiency. It's like chocolate and peanut butter, or peanut butter and jelly, or whatever. They just go so nicely together. We've
gone through several crazy things that the Texas Senate is currently contemplating. Is there anything good going on? I know there's lots of geothermal potential in Texas. I know there's lots of talk about trying to spin up a new nuclear industry. Are there laudable things happening in the legislature right now that we should know about?
Yeah, and let me also say one of my favorite all-time Volts podcasts is the one you did with Jigger Shaw about nuclear. I learned so much from that podcast. I was really very confused, honestly, about what the hell was going on with nuclear. And I think you called it something like that episode, something like what's going on.
What the hell's going on with nuclear?
So it was perfect, and it hit right at the right moment. And the clouds kind of parted, and I understood better. So thanks for that. And I interviewed Rusty Towell and Doug Robison. Rusty is at Abilene Christian University in Texas. Doug Robison is CEO of Natura Resources. They're developing a test reactor. They got, I think, only the second license for an SMR in the United States. It's going to be built at Abilene Christian University.
They're actually going to build one of those things, huh?
They are. They've got their permit from the NRC. It is, as a matter of fact, and I think I put on the post, but you can go to Abilene Christian. I think it's called Next Lab, I think is what their lab is called. And they've got a little time lapse of them actually building the facility where the nuclear plants. Yeah, they are constructing it. It's a 1 megawatt, right? So it's the test reactor. And this is going to take time. It is going to take time. Yeah. But the state, both the House and the Senate, are looking at nuclear incentive bills. And the big bill is House Bill 14 by Chairman Cody Harris in the House. But there's companion legislation in the Senate, Senator Parker, et cetera, that are working on these. And I don't want to be overly negative. There are really good things happening in the state. The governor had put together the Advanced Nuclear Reactor Working Group. It was chaired by then Commissioner Jimmy Glodfelty. They put out a report today that I think is significant, not just because it recommended Texas should be a leader in nuclear and we should deploy nuclear energy. They said that Texas's energy leadership over the last several generations position us, if we do this right, to actually lead the nuclear renaissance with manufacturing in the state. That if we can really, what Jigger said, I think on your podcast, was that small modular reactors are neither small nor modular.
Yes.
Like really making them modular. And if you think of all the industry in Texas around the oil and gas industry, right, and how it's been built up over time, modularizing components, fabricating components, we could do that here on nuclear. And this is where I just sometimes feel crazy. It's like, legislature, why do you want to spend your time trying to destroy the solar industry when you could be doing this instead? It just drives me crazy. And then, by the way, on geothermal, there's been broad bipartisan support. There's a great organization now, Texas Geothermal Association. Definitely look them up, led by Jade Doss and by former Railroad Commission Chair and PUC Chair Barry Smitherman, that are working on geothermal. And that is absolutely directly using the skills of the oil and gas industry. You interviewed Tim Latimer for your podcast, another great episode, former oil and gas employee, Cindy Taft from Sage Geosystems, 35-year veteran of the oil and gas industry, now leading a geothermal company. You're seeing SLB, formerly Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, all these oil field service companies getting into it.
And hey, it's dispatchable.
And it's dispatchable. It's all
unless they arbitrarily define it out of that category.
Oh my God, right? I mean, they might, but hopefully they won't. So look, I think things are happening there with nuclear, with geothermal. There are some good things also happening around energy efficiency. Again, the Senate, to their credit, passed an energy efficiency bill last session. Hopefully they'll do that again. Both the House and Senate base budgets had that $1.8 billion for the backup power packages, which will save lives during the next year. We would have had those.
And those are like behind the meter microgrids. They
could be. It kind of depends how it's rolled out. I think they are thought of right now as something a little bit less than that, sort of more of these like modularized, standardized backup power packages. But yes, I mean, effectively, you could think of the places they go depending on the application as an energy park. But I think the main point is whether it ends up being a bespoke, energy park kind of thing, or whether it ends up being something very standardized for every nursing home. Hurricane Beryl last summer was a Category 1 where Houstonians were without power, a couple 100,000 of them for 1 week.
Ugh.
So God forbid they get a Category 4 or 5. These backup power systems will save lives if they're deployed. And the inverse is true. I hate to state it negatively, but we will lose lives. We know the next major hurricane will come. It's just a question of when, not if. So we really need to get those deployed. And again, to their credit, the legislature has put those into their base budget. Hopefully that crossed. So there's a lot of great stuff happening in Texas. And again, the market is very dynamic. We're seeing a lot of renewables, a lot of storage. This ADR pilot, it really does kind of feel a little bit, to be cliche, but, best of times, worst of times. I told you at the beginning, I'm exhausted. So,
Well, speaking of worst of times and speaking of your exhaustion, tariffs come down, apparently.
Yep.
And even in the absence of any of these crazy bills passing, they're going to do some damage. Have you even had time or mental space to try to wrap your head around what tariffs might do to the growth of all this clean power in Texas?
Well, I did listen to your podcast just from last week. I forget the gentleman's name you had on speaking about tariffs, but it was fantastic. And one of the things he said was, are we going to actually be able to build out these data centers that President Trump wants so bad if we're not able to get the components for the electric infrastructure to build them? So, I mean, it's a real problem. Today, as we're recording, the ERCOT board is going to meet later this afternoon, and they've got a presentation from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas estimate on the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico alone are that it would cost Texas gross state product 1.5%. And it would cost 109,000 Texas jobs just from the Canada and Mexico tariffs. ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas has told the Public Utility Commission, I don't know if he's told the legislature this yet, that he thinks there would be impacts to grid reliability from tariffs because so many of the components on the grid come from overseas. So yeah, I mean, it obviously would be the Texas Association of Business, the statewide chamber, is just sort of beside itself right now that these their CEO has been posting things on LinkedIn that I think the last one was called tariffs or taxes. I mean, people are freaking out down here. I mean, every state would be harmed by tariffs. Texas is uniquely vulnerable to high tariffs.
Interesting. The gentleman who was discussing supply chains is Antoine Vanya Jones of Bloomberg NEF. Just want to give good credit Okay, so I guess final question, if we're wrapping up, I kind of wonder, has watching things play out at the federal level, I think a lot of people inside and outside the business world and the political world had in their heads somebody somewhere in a back room has their hands on the reins here. They're not going to do anything too crazy. And now they are doing very crazy things. And lots of people in the business and political world are like, like they can't be serious. They're not really going to shoot the whole country in the foot like this. Like, it's crazy, but they're doing it. Has that experience increased your appreciation for the possibility that the Texas legislature might really do this? Despite its manifestly obvious negative consequences? Like, are you more scared than you used to be? Or in some senses, the national craziness, do you think, maybe going to push Texas the other way? This is unanswerable, but what's your sense of how the federal craziness is going to affect all this?
I mean, it is to a certain extent unanswerable, but I will say this. I am very worried about what the legislature might do with any of the bills that we've talked about, 819, 715, 388. And Dave, I can't tell you how many other just wild and crazy. I mean, there's a bill to put a moratorium on solar and wind for 2 years. I mean, there's a long list of really damaging bills. And again, damaging not just to renewable energy in Texas, but just damaging to Texas. They're just anti-energy, anti-growth, anti-whatever you want to say bills. And yeah, I mean, it's terrifying. I mean, there's been a lot of bad bills that have passed the legislature in recent sessions, and who knows what's going to happen. And you also have, significant involvement of very high dollar ideological donors.
Yes.
Russell Gold, the great energy writer. I don't think you've ever had Russell Gold on.
I should.
Russell Gold on your, he wrote Superpower. He wrote Boom on the shale boom in North Dakota. Great energy writer, writes for Texas Monthly. Did a cover story on Tim Dunn, a man who made his fortune in the oil and gas industry, sold his business for $2 billion, and is funding candidates at an insane rate, just like a bottomless pit of money. And he is very much on this warpath against renewable energy for ideological reasons. Again, not because he's an oil and gas person. There's lots of oil and gas people that support renewables and see opportunities, even if not directly, just to power their operations, all the stuff we've been talking about. But that's not what this is. So there is absolutely a chance that this session, terrible things will pass. That chance just probably keeps going up from here. Who knows? But yes, I take it extremely seriously. And the sort of analogy used with the federal government of like, is somebody sort of like reining this in? I don't know. I like to think that people are looking at these numbers and going, yeah, I'd really like to not have outages in the summertime when it's 105 degrees.
Should we formally cap our state's economic growth?
It seems like a terrible policy to me, but I'm not in charge. So who knows what'll happen? And yeah, I would think people wouldn't want to have outages when it's 105 and lose their air conditioning, but apparently some people do.
Well, it's white knuckle time for everybody.
Yeah, I'm not resting super easy, and no one involved in any of this stuff will be until June 2nd, which would be what we call sine die, the last day of session.
Yeah.
So
maybe we'll check back in when everything's settled out and see.
Would love to.
Good Lord, what happened? All right, well, thank you so much, Doug Lewin. Love your work, love your newsletter. What a fascinating time to be alive in Texas for you. So I hope you're enjoying this on some level.
It is exciting, never a dull moment. So we got that going for us. Thanks so much, Dave. I really appreciate it. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.